The gymnasium went silent the moment Sterling Halloway's voice cut through the air like a blade. Every conversation stopped, every head turned. Parents froze mid-sentence. Teachers stood with clipboards hanging loose in their hands, and children sensed something terrible was about to happen. Sterling stood 15 feet from the mechanic in oil-stained coveralls, his voice loud enough to reach every corner of Lincoln Elementary's gymnasium, loud enough to make sure everyone heard what he was about to say. He pointed at Silas Thorne like a prosecutor delivering a verdict, his expensive watch catching the fluorescent light, his tailored cashmere sweater and Italian leather shoes announcing exactly who held power in this room. The words came out sharp and cruel, designed to humiliate, designed to destroy. He called the quiet man in work boots a failure, a deadbeat, someone who couldn't even afford decent clothes for his own daughter. He said the little girl deserved better than a father who lived in poverty and worked with his hands. He said these things in front of 200 parents, teachers, and children, including the 6-year-old who stood gripping her father's fingers with both hands, tears already forming in her eyes. But Sterling Halloway had no idea who he was talking to. He didn't know that the man in the stained coveralls had once commanded elite soldiers in mountains where most people would die from altitude alone. He didn't know about the valley in Afghanistan where 17 men survived only because one person chose to stay behind and face impossible odds. He didn't know that the highest-ranking military officer in the United States was about to walk through those gymnasium doors in exactly 4 minutes. And he definitely didn't know that the envelope the mechanic carried in his pocket contained enough evidence to destroy everything Sterling had built with bribes, lies, and offshore bank accounts. The humiliation was about to flip in a way that would change lives, end careers, and prove that some kinds of strength never show up on tax returns or property deeds. 20 minutes earlier, Silas Thorne had pushed through the heavy double doors of Lincoln Elementary at 6:47, 13 minutes late for parent-teacher night. The school sat on the corner of Maple and 5th Street, a 3-story brick building that had been educating children since 1952. Paint peeled from window frames. Playground equipment showed rust at the joints. Chain-link fencing sagged where too many kids had climbed it over the years. But inside, the hallways felt warm despite everything, decorated with construction paper turkeys and hand-traced family trees, spelling tests marked with gold stars, crayon drawings of stick-figure families standing in front of houses with triangle roofs. Tonight, the gymnasium had been transformed for the dual event combining parent conferences with the annual Veterans Appreciation Assembly. Folding tables lined the walls, each representing a different classroom, covered with student projects and graded assignments. At the far end, a small stage held a podium, microphone, and banner reading, "Honoring Those Who Served," in colors that looked like they came from a local print shop. American flags stood in metal stands on either side. Rows of metal folding chairs faced forward, about half filled with parents waiting for the program to begin. Silas still wore his work clothes because Mrs. Henderson's transmission had taken longer than expected, and he couldn't leave a customer stranded with a broken car. Navy blue Dickies coveralls hung on his frame with Thorne Auto Repair embroidered on the chest pocket in thread that had faded from white to gray. The fabric was clean as he could manage after a 10-hour shift, but permanent oil stains marked the knees and elbows like shadows that soap and water couldn't touch. His boots were steel-toed work boots, scuffed brown leather with thick rubber soles that squeaked slightly on the polished gymnasium floor. His hands told stories of their own, calloused and scarred, fingernails trimmed short but still outlined with dark residue that 3 rounds of industrial hand cleaner couldn't fully remove. Marin walked beside him, her small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers, her eyes wide as she took in the decorations and the crowd. She wore her school uniform, navy blue jumper over white polo shirt, white tights already sagging at the ankles, black Mary Janes that flashed red lights in the heels with every step. Her hair pulled back in a ponytail that Silas had done that morning, slightly lopsided but secured with her favorite scrunchie printed with cartoon puppies. She had been nervous all day about tonight, worried her father would be embarrassed by her classwork, or worse, that other parents would judge him for how he looked. She had asked 3 times if he was going to change clothes before coming, and each time he had explained gently that he didn't have time, that his work clothes weren't something to be ashamed of, that people who mattered wouldn't care what he wore. But as they walked toward the table marked Mrs. Patterson, 1st grade, in cheerful bubble letters, Silas noticed the glances. A woman in a cream pantsuit looked up from examining a worksheet, her eyes traveling from his boots to his coveralls to his oil-stained hands before her expression shifted from neutral to something colder. She looked away quickly. A man in khakis and a pressed button-down shirt stepped slightly to the side as Silas passed, creating distance without making it obvious. 2 mothers standing near the water fountain stopped their conversation mid-sentence, their eyes following the mechanic and his daughter across the gym floor. The looks weren't openly hostile, just carefully distant, the kind of quiet judgment that happened in rooms where people sorted each other by clothes and cars and zip codes. Mrs. Patterson saw them approaching, and her face lit up with warmth that seemed genuine. She was in her mid-50s with gray-streaked brown hair cut in a practical bob, glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, wearing a cardigan embroidered with apples and comfortable flats that suggested she spent more time thinking about teaching than fashion. She came around the table and crouched down to Marin's level, her smile wide and encouraging. She told Marin that her butterfly diorama was one of the best projects she had ever seen, and asked if she wanted to show her father. Marin's face brightened immediately. She pulled Silas toward the table where a shoebox sat among other student projects. This one divided into 4 compartments showing the stages of metamorphosis, each carefully labeled in 1st grade handwriting that leaned to the right. The caterpillar was made from green pipe cleaners twisted together, the chrysalis from painted cotton balls, the butterfly from tissue paper and wire that Marin had shaped herself. Silas crouched beside the display, his voice soft as he told his daughter he remembered helping with the glue, but all the ideas had been hers, that he was proud of her. Marin beamed, and Mrs. Patterson smiled at both of them before asking if she could speak with Silas for a moment about Marin's reading progress. She led him a few steps away from the table, lowering her voice to explain that Marin was doing wonderfully, that her reading level sat above grade average and her comprehension was excellent. She wanted to recommend some chapter books they could read together at home, maybe start a series about a girl who solved mysteries or went on adventures. Her tone was encouraging, professional, the voice of someone who genuinely cared about her students. Then a voice cut through the ambient noise of the gymnasium like a knife through fabric. Cold, sharp, familiar. The single word carried across conversations and made heads turn. Thorne. Silas turned slowly, already knowing who he would see. Sterling Halloway stood 15 feet away, flanked by his wife and son. The wife had platinum blonde hair and wore a designer dress that probably cost more than Silas made in 2 months. The son wore a private school uniform, even though this was a public school event, his expression bored and entitled. Sterling himself looked exactly as Silas remembered from the eviction hearing 3 weeks earlier. Tall, broad-shouldered, expensively maintained in the way that came from personal trainers and dermatologists who didn't advertise. Tonight he wore tailored slacks, a cashmere sweater in charcoal gray, Italian leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. His watch was a Rolex, his wedding ring platinum, his teeth whitened to an almost unnatural brightness that suggested regular professional treatments. Sterling was on the school board. He had donated $500,000 for the new computer lab. His name appeared on a plaque in the main hallway beside other benefactors, and he knew exactly who Silas Thorne was. Knew him from property records and eviction paperwork and the contempt that wealthy men sometimes develop for people they consider beneath them. Sterling's voice rose just enough to make sure people nearby would hear, would turn and watch, would witness what he was about to do. He said he didn't realize they let anyone into these events, that he thought parent-teacher night was for parents, not transient workers. The words landed like stones thrown at glass. Mrs. Patterson's expression hardened immediately. She started to speak, to say that Silas was Maren's father and had every right to be there, but Sterling interrupted her before she could finish. His voice took on false courtesy, the tone of someone performing for an audience. He said he knew exactly who Silas was, that Silas was the tenant he had evicted from one of his properties last month for failure to pay rent, for multiple violations, that he was surprised someone like that had time for school events when he couldn't even maintain stable housing for his daughter. The words hit their target with precision. Around them, conversations died. Parents stopped examining student work and turned to watch. Teachers paused mid-sentence. The gymnasium didn't go completely silent, but the noise level dropped noticeably, creating a pocket of attention around Sterling and Silas and the little girl standing between them. Maren's hand tightened around her father's fingers, her small body going rigid with tension. She looked up at Silas, searching his face for a reaction, for some sign of what was happening and whether they should leave. Silas's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm when he spoke, measured and quiet in contrast to Sterling's theatrical volume. He said he had paid rent on time every month for 3 years, that Sterling evicted him because he wanted to tear down the building and put up luxury condos, not because of any violations or missed payments. The statement was simple, factual, delivered without anger or accusation. But it made Sterling's smile widen, made him turn to address the growing audience of parents and teachers who were now openly watching the confrontation unfold. He asked if that was what Silas told himself, if that was the story that helped him sleep at night, that he was some kind of victim. He gestured at Silas's coveralls, his work boots, his oil-stained hands. He said the man couldn't even afford a decent suit for parent-teacher night, told people to look at him, really look at him. He said Silas probably drove a car held together with duct tape and prayers, but he wanted to stand there and lecture about real estate development when he couldn't even provide basic stability for his own child. A few people looked away, uncomfortable with the cruelty on display but unwilling to intervene. Most kept watching, their faces showing a mix of curiosity and second-hand embarrassment, and the ugly satisfaction that sometimes came from witnessing someone else's humiliation. The silence that followed Sterling's words was worse than if people had laughed, because the silence meant agreement, meant acceptance, meant nobody was going to step in and say this was wrong. Maren's eyes filled with tears. She looked up at her father, her voice small and breaking when she asked if they could go. Please, could they just leave? Silas crouched down immediately, bringing himself eye level with his daughter. He put his hand gently on her shoulder, his voice soft and meant only for her. He told her, not yet, that sometimes they had to stand in uncomfortable places, but he promised it was going to be okay. She nodded but didn't look convinced, and when Silas stood back up, Sterling was even closer than before. Sterling's voice dropped to what he probably thought was a private volume but was actually pitched perfectly to carry across the gymnasium, a stage whisper that reached every ear. He said, the real tragedy was that little girl deserved better than this, deserved a father who could provide for her, who could give her opportunities, who wasn't a complete failure at every metric that mattered. The cruelty was calculated, designed to wound, designed to establish dominance in front of witnesses who would remember and repeat the story. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her voice sharp with anger now. She said this was completely inappropriate, that she was going to have to ask Sterling to leave, but Sterling turned on her before she could finish. He reminded her that he had donated the money for her classroom smartboard, that he had funded the library renovation, that he thought he had earned the right to speak his mind at a school event. The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Mrs. Patterson's mouth opened and then closed. Her face flushed red, but she stepped back, defeated by the reality of power and money and the politics that governed even elementary school events. Sterling's smile returned, satisfied, victorious. He turned back to Silas, his confidence absolute, his belief in his own untouchability complete. Silas straightened slowly. His hands, which had been gentle on Marin's shoulder, clenched into fists at his sides before he forced them to relax. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it now, something cold and hard that made the people closest to him take an unconscious step back. He said, "Sterling was right about one thing. Marin deserved better. She deserved to grow up in a world where men like Sterling didn't use money as a weapon to hurt people who couldn't fight back." The words were simple, but they landed differently than Sterling's performance. Landed with the weight of someone who meant every syllable and wasn't performing for anyone. Sterling's smile widened into something uglier. He started to say something about lawsuits, about lawyers, about how Silas was nobody with no power, just a mechanic with a chip on his shoulder and a daughter who would grow up realizing her father was pathetic. But before he could finish, Silas reached into the inner pocket of his coveralls and pulled out an envelope. Manila, standard size but thick with documents that made it bulge slightly. He held it out toward Sterling, his hand steady, his expression unchanged. He said Sterling's office had made a mistake, that they had sent this to him 3 weeks ago, mixed in with the eviction paperwork. He said he thought Sterling might want it back. The statement was delivered calmly, almost conversationally, but something in Silas's eyes made Sterling's confident expression flicker. Sterling snatched the envelope from Silas's hand, his movements jerky and aggressive. He tore it open, pulling out the papers inside. The first page was a ledger, rows and columns of numbers, dates, account codes, names of banks in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, transaction records tied to offshore accounts. Sterling's eyes widened as he scanned the document. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his hands starting to shake. The color drained from his face in stages, going from his healthy tan to pale to something approaching gray. Sterling's hands trembled as he flipped through page after page of documentation that should never have left his office, should never have been sent to anyone outside his inner circle of lawyers and accountants who understood how to make certain transactions disappear. The ledger showed everything. Offshore accounts in the Caymans and Switzerland and Bermuda, kickbacks from city redevelopment contracts that were supposed to be public bids but had been rigged from the start, falsified environmental impact reports, bribes paid to zoning officials, money laundering through real estate transactions that existed only on paper, shell corporations with names that sounded legitimate but were just empty addresses in strip malls and forwarding services. It was years of carefully constructed fraud, millions of dollars moved through channels that were supposed to be untraceable, and somehow, this mechanic in oil-stained coveralls was holding a complete record of all of it. Sterling's voice came out strangled when he finally managed to speak, barely audible over the ambient noise of the gymnasium. He asked where Silas got this, how he got it, his eyes wild with panic that he was trying and failing to hide. Silas's answer was calm, factual, delivered in the same quiet tone he had used for everything else.
He said Sterling's office sent it to him by mistake 3 weeks ago, mixed in with the eviction paperwork. Someone in the legal department must have grabbed the wrong file from the wrong cabinet, must have been moving too fast or too careless, must have assumed that a mechanic getting evicted wouldn't notice or understand what he was looking at. Sterling looked around frantically, suddenly aware of how many people were watching, how many phones might be recording, how many witnesses were seeing him hold documents that could end his career and his freedom. He stepped closer to Silas, close enough that their conversation should have been private, but he couldn't control his voice anymore. It came out in a hiss that carried further than he intended. He told Silas to shut up, to give him the documents and forget he ever saw them. That maybe if Silas cooperated, then Sterling wouldn't make his life even more difficult than it already was. The threat was desperate now, lacking the confidence it had carried just minutes earlier. Sterling was a man watching his empire crack, watching everything he had built start to collapse, and he was grasping for control he no longer had. Silas looked at him for a long moment, his expression unchanged, his voice still quiet when he spoke 3 words that hit Sterling like a physical blow. "I made copies." The statement hung in the air between them. Sterling's face went through a rapid transformation, shock giving way to rage, giving way to fear. His hands crumpled the envelope, his knuckles white with pressure. His voice rose despite his attempt to keep it controlled, desperation bleeding through. He said Silas was making a dangerous enemy. Did he understand that? Did he have any idea what Sterling could do to him? He could make Silas disappear, could make sure he never worked in this city again, could make sure his daughter grew up knowing her father was nothing, was worse than nothing. The threat came out loud enough that parents who had been pretending not to listen stopped pretending. Teachers exchanged glances. A few people pulled out phones, not even hiding it anymore. Sterling realized too late that he was digging himself deeper, that every word he spoke was being witnessed and potentially recorded. But he couldn't stop himself. The panic had taken over. Marin's small voice cut through the tension. She said her father's name, just that one word, but it carried fear and confusion and the sound of a child who didn't understand what was happening but knew it was bad. She looked up at Sterling with wide eyes filling with tears, then at her father, waiting for someone to make this stop. Silas's expression softened immediately when he looked at his daughter. He crouched down again, his hands gentle on her shoulders, his voice soft and reassuring. He told her it was okay, that Mr. Halloway was just leaving. The statement was delivered as fact, not suggestion, and something in Silas's tone made it clear this conversation was over, whether Sterling wanted it to be or not. But Sterling wasn't leaving. His face had gone red with rage and humiliation and fear, all mixed together. He opened his mouth to continue his threats, to say something about lawyers and police and making sure Silas paid for this. The words were forming when the gymnasium doors burst open with a sound like thunder that echoed off the walls and made every person in the room jump. The heavy double doors slammed against the walls with enough force to shake the basketball hoops mounted above them. Every head turned toward the entrance. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. The noise level dropped to complete silence in less than 2 seconds. A group of men in dark suits entered first, moving with synchronized precision that suggested military training. They weren't private security, weren't local police. These men carried themselves differently, scanning the room with practiced efficiency, their posture rigid, their movements economical. They spread out immediately, taking positions near the exits, their eyes never stopping their assessment of the space and the people in it. They wore earpieces, and their jackets bulged slightly in places that suggested concealed weapons. Everything about them screamed Federal Protection Detail. Behind them walked a man whose presence seemed to change the air pressure in the gymnasium. General Vance Sterling was 68 years old, but carried himself like someone 20 years younger. Tall and lean, with silver hair cropped in a military cut that hadn't changed in 4 decades. His face looked carved from stone, weathered by years of decisions that cost lives and saved nations. He wore his dress uniform, dark blue with gold buttons, the fabric pressed to absolute perfection without a single wrinkle. On his shoulders, 4 stars gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His chest displayed rows of ribbons representing campaigns and battles and commendations accumulated over a lifetime of service. Bronze stars, silver stars, the Distinguished Service Cross, campaign ribbons from Iraq and Afghanistan and conflicts that didn't have public names. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the United States, the most powerful military leader in the nation. Principal Alvarez rushed forward from where she had been standing near the stage, her heels clicking rapidly on the gymnasium floor, her smile wide and nervous. She welcomed the general, said they were honored to have him, that the assembly was scheduled to begin in just a few minutes. Her voice carried the strained enthusiasm of someone trying to manage an important event while knowing she was completely out of her depth. The general didn't look at her. His eyes were scanning the crowd with the efficiency of someone trained to assess situations in seconds, to identify threats and allies and objectives. His gaze moved across faces, taking in parents and teachers and children, cataloging the room. And then his eyes stopped. Not on the principal, not on the stage where he was supposed to speak. On a man in oil-stained coveralls standing near a first-grade classroom display. The general's face changed in a way that few people had ever seen. The professional mask cracked. Something raw showed through. Something that looked like shock and disbelief and recognition all happening at once. He stood completely still for 3 full seconds, as if movement might shatter whatever he was seeing, might prove it was a mistake or a hallucination brought on by too many years looking for someone who was supposed to be dead. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, clenched into fists and then released. Whatever he was feeling, it was powerful enough to break through decades of military discipline and emotional control. Then he started walking. Not toward the stage where Principal Alvarez was gesturing, not toward the rows of folding chairs where parents and students waited, directly toward Silas Thorne. His stride was purposeful, each step measured and deliberate. The crowd parted instinctively, parents stepping back to create a clear path, conversations dying as people realized something significant was happening, even if they didn't understand what. Principal Alvarez tried to keep pace beside the general, her voice rising with polite confusion. She said the program was about to start, that perhaps he would like to take his seat on the stage, that they had prepared remarks for him to review. The general walked past her as if she didn't exist, as if her words were just background noise that didn't warrant acknowledgement. Sterling Halloway, still holding the crumpled envelope, still reeling from the exposure of his fraud, saw an opportunity to salvage something from this disaster. He straightened his shoulders, composed his face into something approaching confidence, and stepped forward with his hand extended. His voice came out loud and cheerful, the performance of a man pretending the last 5 minutes hadn't happened. He introduced himself, said what an honor it was to meet the general, added that they shared a last name, though unfortunately weren't related. He forced a laugh at his own observation. He said he was the primary benefactor for the school's technology program, that he had donated over $500,000 to modernize their computer labs and library. He was clearly expecting recognition, gratitude, perhaps a photo opportunity that he could use later for publicity. The general walked past him, not around him, through the space where Sterling stood, as if Sterling was invisible, as if his extended hand and his words and his expensive clothes meant absolutely nothing. The general's eyes never left Silas. He didn't slow down, didn't acknowledge Sterling's existence with even a glance. Sterling's hand hung in the air, empty and foolish. His smile froze on his face and then cracked completely. His arm dropped to his side. Around him, parents gasped. Whispers erupted like fire catching dry grass. Someone's phone was definitely recording now, multiple phones, capturing the moment when Sterling Halloway got publicly dismissed by the most powerful military officer in the country. The general stopped 3 feet from Silas Thorne. The contrast between them couldn't have been more stark. The general, in his immaculate dress uniform, every detail perfect, 4 stars gleaming on his shoulders, rows of ribbons telling stories of a lifetime at the highest levels of military command. Silas, in his oil-stained coveralls, scuffed work boots, hands marked with grease and calluses from 10 hours of fixing transmissions and changing oil. Marin peeked out from behind her father's leg, her eyes wide as she looked up at the tall man with all the shiny things on his chest. The general's expression was unreadable now, locked into professional control. He stood at rigid attention, spine straight, shoulders back, chin level. His right hand snapped to his brow in a salute so sharp and precise it seemed to cut the air itself. The sound echoed across the silent gymnasium like a whip crack. 200 people stood frozen, not breathing, not moving, trying to understand what they were seeing. The general's voice was tight when he spoke, controlled but with emotion underneath that he was barely containing. He said the name Colonel Thorne, and the title hit the room like a bomb detonating. Not Mr. Thorne, not Sir. Colonel. The word echoed off the gymnasium walls and bounced back, repeating itself in the stunned silence. Parents looked at each other in confusion. Teachers stood with their mouths open. Sterling Halloway's face drained of all remaining color. The general continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. He said they had been searching for 5 years, that the men of the 75th Ranger Regiment had never stopped looking for the man who saved them. The words detonated in the silence. Questions erupted from every direction, overlapping and desperate. Parents asking each other what was happening, teachers whispering, children asking their parents who that man was, why the general was saluting someone in work clothes. Phones came out openly now, recording, photographing, capturing something that felt historic, even if nobody fully understood it yet. Silas stood frozen, his eyes locked on the general's face. Slowly, almost reluctantly, his hand rose to his brow. The movement was textbook perfect, muscle memory taking over after years away from uniform. His salute was as crisp as the general's, the precision of it revealing training that didn't fade no matter how long someone spent fixing cars instead of commanding soldiers. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost apologetic. He said he was just Silas now. That title didn't fit anymore, that he had left that life behind. The statement was simple, but it carried weight, carried the sound of someone who had made a choice and stood by it. The general's jaw clenched. When he spoke again, his voice carried across the gymnasium, commanding attention the way only a voice trained to lead men in combat could. He said, "Not to us. Never to us." The words hit with finality. Then he lowered his salute and crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with Marin, who was staring at him with a mixture of fear and fascination. His weathered face softened completely. He told her in a gentle voice that her father wasn't in trouble, that her father was a hero, the kind who saved lives and didn't ask for anything in return. Marin looked from the general to her father, confusion written all over her small face. She said her father fixed cars, her voice uncertain, trying to make sense of what this stranger was saying. The general smiled, and it transformed his entire expression. He told her that was true. Her father did fix cars now. But before that, he saved lives. including the life of the man crouching in front of her. The statement was delivered simply, without drama, but it landed with the weight of absolute truth. The general stood and turned to address the entire gymnasium, his voice taking on the tone of someone who had briefed presidents and testified before Congress, someone whose words carried the authority of rank and experience and absolute credibility. He told them all that the man standing before them, the one some of them had been looking at with judgment and pity just minutes ago, was Colonel Silas Thorne. He said Silas had saved 17 lives in the Hindu Kush mountains of Afghanistan in 2015, that 17 soldiers were alive today because of a choice this man made when death was certain and survival was impossible. The gymnasium was silent now except for the general's voice. Every person stood completely still, hanging on his words. He described an ambush in a valley where the terrain favored the enemy and survival odds approached 0. 3 vehicles carrying 50 American soldiers under his command, pinned down by superior numbers and superior positioning. Rocket-propelled grenades destroying their lead vehicle. Casualties mounting. Extraction 20 minutes out, 20 minutes they didn't have. 20 minutes that meant everyone was going to die in that valley. The general's voice dropped lower but somehow became more intense. He said Colonel Thorne was commanding the lead vehicle, was in the position that took the most fire, had the clearest path to retreat and save himself and his crew. He said Silas could have run, could have pulled back to defensive positions, could have prioritized his own survival the way most people would in that situation. Instead, he ordered his men to fall back and he stayed behind. Alone, drawing fire, calling in coordinates for air support, buying time measured in minutes and seconds and heartbeats, time purchased with his own blood and his own certainty that he wasn't going to make it out. A woman in the crowd made a sound halfway between a gasp and a sob. Someone else whispered something that might have been a prayer. The general continued, his voice thick with emotion he wasn't fully controlling anymore. He said Silas took 7 rounds, 2 in the chest, 3 in the legs, 1 in the shoulder. One that grazed his skull and left a scar he probably still carried. He lost more than half the blood in his body. When they finally secured the area and went back to extract him, they were expecting to recover a body, to bring home remains, to add another name to the list of soldiers who died buying time for their brothers. The general paused, letting the image sink in, letting people understand what that meant. And he said Silas was still alive when they reached him, still conscious, still fighting, still calling in coordinates to make sure everyone else made it out safely. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, the first time his composure had truly broken. The gymnasium was so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights became audible. Parents stood with tears running down their faces. The teacher had her hand over her mouth. Even the children sensed the weight of what they were hearing, standing silent and still in a way they rarely did. The general's gaze swept across the faces of parents and teachers and school board members, and there was judgment in his eyes now. Judgment for everyone who had watched Sterling Halloway humiliate this man and said nothing. He told them that they had classified Silas's service record, buried his identity as killed in action to protect ongoing operations and the soldiers still in the field. He said the President of the United States kept a Medal of Honor in a desk drawer in the Oval Office with Colonel Thorne's name on it, had been waiting 5 years for the day they found him so they could present it properly, so they could acknowledge what he had done and what he had given. A reporter from the local newspaper who had been covering the Veterans Assembly for a community interest piece stood with his camera hanging forgotten around his neck. He asked in a shaky voice why Silas had disappeared, why he hadn't come forward, why he had let everyone think he was dead. The question hung in the air, and every eye turned to Silas, waiting for an answer. Silas's voice was quiet when he responded, almost lost in the acoustics of the large room. He said he didn't want the attention, that he just wanted to raise his daughter in peace, that the medals and the recognition weren't things he needed or wanted. The general nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. He said Silas chose his daughter over glory, chose peace over recognition, chose a quiet life over the accolades that most people would kill for. He said that choice, that willingness to walk away from everything the military could offer, was the true measure of the man. He turned back to Sterling Halloway, who had been standing frozen in humiliation and shock, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The general's voice was ice when he spoke. He said he had heard Sterling from outside, that the doors had been opened, that he had heard every word Sterling said about failure and poverty and that little girl deserving better. Sterling tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. His face had gone from gray to white, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air in the gymnasium. The general stepped closer to him, not threatening, but with the kind of presence that made grown men instinctively back up. He said he wanted to talk about failure, about what that word really meant. He said failure was standing in safety while others fought and died. Failure was using wealth as a weapon against people who had sacrificed everything so that men like Sterling could sleep safely in their expensive houses and build their real estate empires. Failure was mocking a man who had given everything to protect the freedom that Sterling took for granted every single day of his privileged life. The words landed like hammer blows. Sterling tried to speak again, tried to say he didn't know, that if he had known who Silas was, he never would have said those things. The excuse came out strangled and desperate. The general cut him off before he could finish. He said that was exactly the problem, that Sterling didn't think, that he judged people by their clothes and their bank accounts instead of their character and their sacrifice. He said the man Sterling had called a failure was the bravest person the general had ever served with, and Sterling's opinion on the subject meant less than nothing. The general turned away from Sterling like he was dismissing him from existence and looked back at Silas. His expression softened again. He said he needed a moment of Silas's time, just a brief conversation, and asked if they could speak privately. Silas nodded slowly. He looked down at Marin and told her to stay with Mrs. Patterson for just a minute. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward immediately, her eyes red with tears, and took Marin's hand. She told Marin they could look at her diorama again, could count all the butterflies in the other student projects. Marin nodded, but her eyes stayed on her father, worry written across her small face. The general led Silas toward the corner of the gymnasium, away from the crowd. His security detail moved smoothly to create a perimeter, giving them privacy, keeping parents and teachers and curious reporters at a distance. When they were far enough away that no one could overhear, the general's professional mask slipped completely. His voice came out rough with emotion. He said seeing Silas alive meant more than he could express, that they had thought when Silas disappeared from the VA hospital in Germany that maybe he couldn't handle what had happened, that maybe he had chosen a different kind of ending. The implication hung heavy between them. Silas shook his head, his voice quiet but firm. He said he was fine, that he just wanted a different life for himself and for Marin, that the military and everything it represented wasn't something he could be anymore. The general nodded, understanding in his eyes, but his expression remained serious. He said he respected that choice, truly respected it, but he needed to ask something, and he needed Silas to really consider the answer before responding. The preamble made Silas tense, made his hands clench slightly at his sides. The general's next words came out carefully measured,
each one weighted with implications that Silas could already sense before they were fully spoken.
He said the gray sector was operational again, that the classified program they had both believed was shut down in 2016 had been reactivated based on new intelligence. He said there was a situation developing, something in Afghanistan that required people with specific experience and specific skills. His voice dropped even lower. He said there were 12 American hostages, civilians who had been working on infrastructure projects, teachers and engineers and medical personnel. 4 of them were children under the age of 10. The information hit Silas like a physical blow. His hands, which had been steady all night through Sterling's humiliation and the general's unexpected arrival, started to tremble. He clenched them into fists to make the shaking stop, but it didn't fully work. The general watched this reaction and continued speaking, his voice gentle now, but relentless. He said they needed someone who knew the terrain intimately, who understood the tribal dynamics and the political complexities, who could operate in that specific environment with the kind of expertise that couldn't be taught in training. He said they needed someone who had proven they could make impossible choices under impossible circumstances. He said they needed Silas. Silas closed his eyes. For a long moment he stood there, silent, and the general waited without pushing. Memories flooded back unbidden. The valley, the sound of gunfire echoing off mountain walls, the radio crackling with voices of men calling for help, for air support, for extraction that was too far away. The choice to stay when every instinct screamed to run. The feeling of rounds hitting body armor, hitting flesh, the strange detachment that came with blood loss and shock. The faces of men he saved. The faces of men he couldn't save. The weight of command and the weight of guilt and the weight of surviving when others didn't. He opened his eyes and looked across the gymnasium to where Marin stood with Mrs. Patterson, looking at construction paper butterflies and trying not to cry. She was watching him with complete trust, complete faith that whatever was happening, her father would handle it, and they would be okay. That trust was the heaviest weight of all. Silas thought about his wife, Sarah, about the promise he had made at her bedside 3 years ago when cancer was taking her and time was running out. She had made him swear he would be there for Marin, that he would give their daughter the childhood he never had, that he wouldn't leave her the way his own father had left him. She had made him promise he wouldn't go back to that life, that he would choose Marin over duty and honor and all the things the military taught them mattered most. Silas asked what would happen if he said no, his voice barely above a whisper. The general's answer was honest in a way that felt brutal. He said they would send someone else, someone younger with less experience, someone who probably wouldn't make it back. He paused, then added that the hostages probably wouldn't make it back either. The statement wasn't manipulation, just fact, the kind of cold calculation that happened at the highest levels of military command, where success rates and acceptable losses were discussed in conference rooms far from the actual fighting. Silas felt the weight of that answer settle into his chest like lead. He thought about the young soldiers he had trained over the years, the ones who looked up to him and called him sir and meant it with respect that felt unearned. He thought about them going into a situation he could handle, dying because he wasn't there, because he had chosen comfort over duty. He thought about 12 civilians, 4 of them children, waiting in whatever hell they were trapped in, wondering if anyone was coming, if anyone cared enough to risk everything for strangers. But he also thought about Marin, about her birthday next month when she would turn 7, about the school play where she was playing a tree and took it so seriously she practiced standing still for hours until her legs ached, about the way she looked at him like he could solve any problem, fix any hurt, make everything okay. About the mornings when she climbed into his bed and asked him to tell her stories about her mother. About the life they had built together in a small apartment above an auto shop. A life that wasn't glamorous or impressive, but was theirs. The choice was impossible. The choice was also the easiest thing he had ever done. Silas opened his eyes and looked at the general, his voice steady when he spoke. He said he was sorry, truly sorry, but he was on a different mission now. He said Marin was the only commanding officer he answered to anymore. He nodded toward his daughter, who waved at him from across the gymnasium with a small, uncertain smile. The general followed his gaze and was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, and there was deep respect in his eyes, the kind of respect that came from understanding exactly what that choice cost. He said he understood, that he thought Silas was making the right decision, that some missions mattered more than others and this one mattered most. He stood at attention one more time and delivered a final salute, crisp and perfect, not for the colonel, but for the father. He said the offer would always stand, that if Silas ever changed his mind, the door would be open. But his tone suggested he knew that door would never be opened, that this was goodbye in a way that felt final. Silas returned the salute one last time, then walked back across the gymnasium toward his daughter. The crowd parted for him again, but this time the looks were completely different. Respect, reverence, awe. Parents who had judged him for his coveralls and his work boots now looked at him like they were seeing someone for the first time. A few people started clapping. Then more. Within seconds, the entire gymnasium was applauding, the sound building and echoing off the walls like thunder. Some people were crying. A man in a suit who had stepped away from Silas earlier now stepped forward and extended his hand, mumbling an apology that Silas accepted with a nod. Mrs. Patterson handed Marin back to her father, and Marin wrapped her arms around his neck, holding tight. She asked in a whisper if he was really a hero, like the general said. Silas held her close, his voice soft in her ear. He told her no, that he was just her dad. That was all that mattered. Marin pulled back to look at him, her expression serious beyond her years. She said those were the same thing. The simple statement hit Silas harder than anything Sterling had said, harder than the general's request, harder than the choice he had just made. He held his daughter close and didn't trust himself to speak. As they turned to leave, a voice called out from the crowd, "Colonel Thorne, wait!" Silas turned to see the newspaper reporter, camera now raised and ready, his professional instincts overriding his shock. The reporter asked what was next. Would Silas accept the Medal of Honor? Would he return to service? What message did he have for the community? The questions came rapid fire, the kind reporters asked when they sensed a story bigger than they had expected. Silas looked at the reporter, then at the crowd of parents and teachers still watching, still waiting. He could give them the speech they expected, could talk about duty and honor and sacrifice, could say all the things that would make good headlines and sound impressive. Instead, he just smiled, tired but genuine, and said he was going home. He said tomorrow he was taking his daughter to the park. The answer was so simple, so profoundly ordinary, that it seemed to shock people more than anything else he could have said. The applause built again, louder this time, more sustained. Parents were openly crying now. Teachers hugging each other, even some of the children clapping because the adults were. The sound followed Silas and Marin as they walked toward the exit, past Sterling Halloway, who stood frozen in his own private disaster, still holding the crumpled envelope that contained evidence of crimes that would destroy him. Past Principal Alvarez, who looked like she was trying to figure out how to salvage the Veterans Assembly program. Past rows of folding chairs and student projects and American flags that suddenly felt more meaningful than they had 20 minutes ago. They pushed through the heavy double doors and stepped into the cool night air. The parking lot stretched out before them, half empty under sodium lights that cast everything in orange. Silas's truck sat in the back corner where he always parked it, a 15-year-old Ford F-150 with rust spots along the wheel wells and a crack in the windshield that he kept meaning to replace but never found time for. The truck was nothing special, just a working vehicle that got him from place to place. But right now, it represented exactly what he had chosen: a normal life, a quiet life, a life where the biggest decision was whether to stop for ice cream on the way home. He set Maren down and took her hand, walking slowly across the parking lot. She was quiet for a moment, processing everything that had happened, trying to make sense of a night that had started with her worried about her butterfly diorama and ended with her father being saluted by the most important military person in the country. Finally, she looked up at him, her voice small in the darkness. She asked if they were still going to have to move, if they were still going to lose their apartment. Silas had already received a phone call that afternoon, had stepped away from Mrs. Henderson's transmission to take it in the small office at the back of the shop. A lawyer named Marcus Chen, who specialized in tenant rights, who had heard about Silas's eviction case through the legal community grapevine, who wanted to take it pro bono because he said it was time someone stood up to Sterling Halloway's practices. The lawyer said they had a strong case, that the eviction violated multiple housing regulations, that he was confident they could not only fight it, but potentially get damages. And the envelope Silas had given Sterling tonight, the copy he had mentioned making, that copy had been mailed to the FBI field office that morning. By tomorrow, Sterling would have much bigger problems than real estate development. Silas told his daughter they weren't going anywhere, that they were staying right where they were, that their apartment was their home and nobody was taking it away. Maren's smile was bright enough to light up the dark parking lot. She said, "Good." She liked their apartment. She liked being close to her school. She really liked Mrs. Patterson and didn't want to change teachers. Her concerns were so beautifully simple, so perfectly 6 years old, that Silas felt his chest tighten with love and relief and gratitude that this was his life now. He lifted her into the truck and buckled her into her booster seat, the familiar routine grounding him after a night that had been anything but routine. He closed her door and walked around to the driver's side, pausing for a moment to look back at the school. Through the gymnasium windows, he could see the Veterans Assembly had started, the general at the podium, parents and students in their seats. The program would go on without the drama that had preceded it, though Silas suspected his unexpected presence would be the only thing anyone remembered about tonight. He climbed into the truck and started the engine, the familiar rattle and hum of machinery that he understood completely, that he could fix when it broke, that didn't require impossible choices or classified missions or leaving his daughter behind. The radio came on automatically, some country station playing a song about small towns and simple lives. Maren asked if they could stop for ice cream, even though it was a school night, her voice hopeful in the way that suggested she already knew the answer would probably be no, but was willing to try anyway. Silas looked at her in the rearview mirror. This small person who was his entire world, who trusted him completely, who thought he was a hero for reasons that had nothing to do with valleys in Afghanistan or medals in desk drawers. He said yes, they could get ice cream, just this once, because tonight had been a big night, and sometimes big nights deserved ice cream. Maren's delighted squeal made him smile despite everything, made the weight on his chest feel a little lighter. They drove through streets Silas knew by heart, past the auto shop where he spent his days, past the grocery store where they shopped on Saturdays, past the park where they went on Sunday afternoons when the weather was good. This was his territory now, measured in blocks and traffic lights instead of grid coordinates and extraction points. He thought about the general's request, about 12 hostages and 4 children and soldiers who would go in his place. The guilt was there, sharp and familiar, the guilt that came from surviving when others didn't, from choosing safety when others were in danger. But he also thought about promises made and promises kept, about Sarah making him swear he would be there for their daughter, would give Marin the stability and presence he had never had growing up, about the choice he had made tonight and every night for the past 3 years, the choice to be a father first and everything else second. The guilt didn't disappear, but it settled into something he could carry, something that didn't crush him under its weight. They pulled into the parking lot of an ice cream shop that stayed open late, a local place that had been there for 30 years and served portions big enough to share. Silas ordered Marin's favorite, strawberry with rainbow sprinkles, and got himself a coffee because the night felt long and he was still processing everything that had happened. They sat at a small table by the window, Marin swinging her legs and talking between bites about her diorama and whether the butterflies in the classroom would turn into real butterflies someday. Silas listened and responded and felt something close to peace. This was his mission now. This table, this moment, this little girl with ice cream on her nose asking questions about metamorphosis. No medals required, no recognition needed. Just the two of them building a life together, one ordinary moment at a time. The next morning came too early, the way mornings always did when the alarm went off at 5:30. Silas woke in the small apartment above the auto shop, sunlight just starting to filter through thin curtains that didn't quite block the glow of streetlights. He lay there for a moment, listening to the sounds of the city waking up around him. Traffic starting to build on the main road 2 blocks over. The bakery across the street opening for the early morning crowd. The familiar creaks and settling of an old building that had housed dozens of tenants over the decades. He got up quietly, moving through the routine that had become automatic over 3 years of single parenthood. Started coffee, made Marin's lunch, peanut butter and jelly because that was what she would actually eat, plus carrot sticks she would probably trade to her friend Emma for cookies. Laid out her school uniform on the chair in her room, took a shower in the bathroom where the water pressure was weak and the hot water ran out after 10 minutes. By the time Marin woke up, the apartment smelled like coffee and toast. She wandered into the kitchen, still half asleep, her hair sticking up in directions that defied gravity, wearing pajamas with unicorns on them. She climbed into her chair at the small table and asked if last night really happened or if she dreamed it. Silas told her it really happened, that the general and the salute and all of it was real. She was quiet for a moment, processing, then asked if that meant her father was famous now. Silas smiled and said no, it just meant some people knew something about him they hadn't known before. But nothing had really changed. He was still going to work at the shop, she was still going to school, they were still going to the park on Sunday. Marin seemed satisfied with this answer. She ate her cereal and talked about a game she wanted to play at recess and whether Mrs. Patterson would let them do art projects today. The normalcy of it felt precious. Silas drove her to school, the same route they took every morning, past the same landmarks and through the same intersections. He walked her to the front entrance where parents were dropping off children, lunchboxes and backpacks and goodbye hugs. A few parents looked at him differently this morning, recognition in their eyes, a couple of them offering smiles that seemed warmer than usual. One mother he had never spoken to came up and thanked him for his service, her voice sincere but awkward, like she wasn't sure what else to say. Silas thanked her and said he appreciated it, keeping his responses brief and polite, not wanting to make it into something bigger than it needed to be. Marin hugged him goodbye and ran off to join her friends, already launching into a story about ice cream and staying up past bedtime. Silas watched her go, waited until she disappeared through the doors, then walked back to his truck. The auto shop was quiet when he arrived,
just the way he liked it in the early morning before customers started calling with emergencies and appointments. He unlocked the bay doors and flipped on the lights, fluorescent bulbs flickering to life and illuminating the workspace he knew better than anywhere else.
Tool chests organized exactly how he wanted them. The lift in the center bay, the smell of oil and metal and rubber. This was his domain now, where the problems had solutions and the solutions required wrenches instead of weapons. He was under a Honda Civic replacing brake pads when his phone rang. The number wasn't one he recognized, but the area code was Washington, D.C. He almost didn't answer, almost let it go to voicemail. But something made him wipe his hands on a rag and pick up. The voice on the other end identified himself as someone from the Department of Defense, said he was calling on behalf of the secretary, said they wanted to arrange a formal ceremony for the Medal of Honor presentation if Colonel Thorne was willing. Silas listened to the polite official language, the careful phrasing that suggested this was important and significant and something he should want. When the voice finished talking and waited for a response, Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said he appreciated the offer, but he was going to decline. The voice seemed confused, asked if he understood what was being offered, if he realized the honor and recognition that came with it. Silas said he understood perfectly, that he was grateful for the consideration, but his answer was still no. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that suggested the person had a script for various responses, but not for this one. Finally, the voice said they would note his decision, but the offer would remain open if he changed his mind. Silas thanked him and ended the call. He went back to the brake pads, to the simple mechanical problem that required nothing more than time and attention and the right tools. By mid-morning, the phone calls started coming to the shop. A reporter from the local newspaper wanting an interview, someone from a veterans organization wanting him to speak at their next event, a producer from a morning talk show saying they would love to have him on to tell his story. Silas declined them all politely, said he appreciated their interest, but he wasn't looking for publicity or attention, that he just wanted to get back to his regular life. The calls kept coming throughout the day. By afternoon, he stopped answering, let them all go to voicemail, deleted the messages without listening to most of them. A few customers who came in mentioned seeing something on the news about what happened at the school, asked if he was the same Silas Thorne. He confirmed he was, but redirected conversations back to their cars, to oil changes and tire rotations and the kind of small talk that didn't require explanations or stories about Afghanistan. By the end of the week, the attention had mostly faded. The local newspaper ran a story, but it was respectful, focused more on the Veterans Assembly and the General's visit than on Silas personally. A few news sites picked it up, but it didn't go viral, didn't become the kind of story that dominated social media and cable news cycles. Silas was grateful for that, grateful that the world seemed willing to let him return to obscurity. Sterling Halloway wasn't as fortunate. The FBI had opened an investigation based on the documents Silas provided. The story broke 3 days after parent-teacher night. Front page of the business section, Sterling's photo above a headline about fraud and corruption and offshore accounts. His real estate company's stock price collapsed. Board members resigned. Partners distanced themselves. By the end of the week, Sterling was facing federal charges that would likely put him in prison for a decade or more. Silas felt no satisfaction from this, no sense of victory or revenge. It was just justice, the kind that happened when illegal actions came to light and systems worked the way they were supposed to. Marcus Chen, the tenant rights lawyer, called to say the eviction had been permanently blocked and they were moving forward with a lawsuit against Sterling's company for illegal practices. Silas told him to do whatever he thought was right, but he didn't want to be vindictive, just wanted to protect his home. Sunday came and Silas kept his promise. He and Marin went to the park, the same one they visited most weekends, with the old playground equipment and the pond where ducks gathered hoping for bread. They fed the ducks with food Silas had brought that was actually appropriate for them, not bread, which he had learned wasn't good for their digestion.
Marin ran around the playground, climbing and sliding and swinging, her laughter carrying across the grass. Other parents were there with their children, the usual weekend crowd. A few recognized Silas from the news coverage, from the story that had briefly made him known beyond the neighborhood. Most just saw father watching his daughter play. Nothing remarkable, nothing that stood out. That was exactly what Silas wanted. To be unremarkable, to be normal, to be just another parent at the park on a Sunday afternoon. Marin came running over, breathless and excited, asking if they could get lunch at the place that made grilled cheese the way she liked it. Silas said yes, and they walked together to a small cafe 2 blocks from the park. They sat at a table by the window, and Marin talked about school and her friends, and a book Mrs. Patterson was reading to the class. She didn't mention the general or the gymnasium or any of it. For her, it had already become just another memory, already filing itself away with all the other moments of her childhood that would blur together over time. For Silas, it was different. The choice he had made that night would stay with him, would resurface in quiet moments when he wondered about those 12 hostages, about whether someone else had gone in his place, about whether they made it out. The guilt would be there, probably always, the weight of choosing his daughter over duty. But when he looked at Marin, eating her grilled cheese and swinging her legs under the table, he knew he had made the right choice. The only choice he could live with. They went home in the afternoon, back to the apartment above the shop. Marin did homework at the kitchen table while Silas prepped dinner, something simple that he could cook without much thought. They ate together, cleaned up together, fell into the evening routine that had become their life. Bath time and pajamas and a story before bed. Marin's choice tonight was the same book they had read a dozen times, about a caterpillar that turned into a butterfly, and she still asked the same questions about whether it hurt to change and whether the butterfly remembered being a caterpillar. Silas answered the same way he always did, that he didn't know, but he thought maybe the butterfly was grateful for what it had been even as it became something new. Marin seemed to accept this, her eyes already drooping as sleep pulled at her. Silas kissed her forehead and turned off the light, leaving her door cracked open the way she liked it. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her sleep. This small person who had changed everything about his life and made him into someone he never expected to be. A father. Just a father. Not a colonel or a hero or anything that required medals or recognition. Just someone who made lunches and went to parent-teacher conferences and read bedtime stories about caterpillars. The apartment was quiet after Marin fell asleep. Silas made himself coffee, even though it was late, sat at the kitchen table with the lights dim, looking out the window at the street below. Couples walking home from dinner. A group of teenagers laughing about something. A man walking his dog. Normal life continuing all around him, unremarkable and beautiful in its ordinariness. His phone buzzed with a message. He almost ignored it, but something made him check. It was from the general. Just a few words. 12 souls home safe. Team returned. Thank you for your service, both past and present. The message hit Silas hard. Confirmation that someone else had gone on that mission, that they had succeeded where success seemed impossible, that those hostages were alive because someone had stepped up when Silas stepped back. The guilt eased slightly, knowing the outcome, knowing his choice hadn't cost lives even if it easily could have. He typed a response. Glad they made it. Give my respect to the team. He hesitated, then added, made the right choice for me. Hope you understand. The general's response came quickly. I do. Your mission is more important than mine ever was. The words settled something inside Silas, gave him permission to let go of the weight he had been carrying. The weeks that followed fell into rhythm. Work at the shop, school runs with Marin, evenings at home, weekends at the park. The attention faded completely. People stopped recognizing him on the street. The news cycle moved on to other stories, other heroes, other scandals. Sterling Halloway's trial was set for next year, but that was someone else's story now. Something Silas would maybe read about in the newspaper, but wouldn't be directly involved in. Marcus Chen called with updates about the lawsuit, about settlements being offered, about Sterling's company trying to make things right before the criminal trial made everything worse. Silas told him to accept whatever was fair, but he didn't need to punish anyone, just wanted to secure his housing and move forward. The lawyer seemed almost disappointed, like he had been hoping for a fight, but he respected Silas's decision. Marin's birthday came in late October. Silas threw her a party at the apartment, invited 6 of her friends from school, made a cake that wasn't perfect but was homemade, and that was what mattered. They played games and ate too much sugar, and the kids were loud and chaotic in the way that 7-year-olds were. Parents came to pick up their children and stayed to chat, comfortable conversations about school and weather and the kind of small talk that didn't require history or explanation. Mrs. Patterson came by with a present, a set of books about science and nature that she thought Marin would love. She stayed for cake and told Silas quietly that she was proud of him, not for what happened in Afghanistan, but for what he was doing every day, for being present for his daughter, for showing up and doing the hard work of parenting. The compliment meant more than any medal ever could. As the party wound down and the apartment returned to quiet, Marin sat surrounded by presents and wrapping paper, her face sticky with frosting, happy in the uncomplicated way that children could be. She told Silas this was the best birthday ever, that she loved him more than anything. Silas held her close and told her he loved her too, that she was the best thing that ever happened to him, that being her father was the greatest honor he would ever receive. That night, after Marin was asleep, Silas sat again at the kitchen table with coffee and silence. He thought about the path his life had taken, the choices made and not made, the doors opened and closed. He thought about the valley in Afghanistan, about the men he saved, about the ones who didn't make it. He thought about Sarah and the promise he made, about Marin and the life they were building. He thought about the general's message, about missions accomplished and missions declined, about duty and honor and the different forms they could take. The truth was simple, even if it had taken him years to fully accept it. Strength wasn't about battles won or enemies defeated or medals earned. Strength was showing up every day for the people who needed you. Strength was making breakfast and packing lunches and attending school events even when you were tired. Strength was choosing the quiet life over the dangerous one, choosing presence over glory, choosing love over duty when duty had already taken so much. Silas Thorne had been a soldier. He had commanded men in combat, had made impossible decisions under impossible circumstances, had saved lives at the cost of nearly losing his own. That was true and real and part of who he was. But it wasn't all of who he was. It wasn't even the most important part anymore. Now he was a father, a mechanic, a man who lived above an auto shop and drove a truck with rust spots and made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches every morning. A man who read bedtime stories and wiped away tears and celebrated birthdays with homemade cake. A man who had walked away from medals and recognition and the respect of generals because something more important was waiting at home. The apartment was quiet around him. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. Inside, his daughter slept safe and warm, dreaming whatever dreams 7-year-olds dreamed, secure in the knowledge that her father would be there when she woke up. That security, that certainty, that promise kept every single day. That was Silas's mission now. That was the war worth winning. That was everything that mattered. And in the quiet of that Sunday night, in an apartment above an auto shop on the corner of Maple and Fifth, Silas Thorne was exactly where he needed to be. Not in a valley in Afghanistan, not in a ceremony at the White House, not anywhere but here, in this ordinary life that he had chosen, in this role that required no uniform or rank or recognition. Just a father loving his daughter. Just a man keeping his promises. Just someone who understood that the greatest acts of courage sometimes looked like the smallest acts of love. The story could have ended differently. It could have ended with glory and medals and headlines. It could have ended with Silas returning to service, to the life that valued his skills and experience and willingness to sacrifice. But it didn't end that way. It ended here, in the quiet, in the ordinary, in the choice made every day to be present for the person who needed him most. And that ending, that choice, that life, was worth more than any medal ever minted or any honor ever bestowed. It was worth everything. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that strength comes in many forms and heroes live in ordinary places, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us about the quiet heroes in your life, the people who showed up when it mattered, who chose love over glory, who understood that the greatest missions are often the ones that never make headlines. Your story might inspire someone else. Your words might be exactly what another person needs to hear. So share, comment, engage, and let's build a community that celebrates the kind of strength that doesn't need recognition because it's too busy doing what matters.